The morning sun cast long shadows across the busy terminal at Cincinnati Northern Kentucky International Airport as J.D. Vance approached the departure gate with his usual confident stride. The Ohio senator had been traveling frequently between Washington and his home state, maintaining the delicate balance between his senatorial duties and staying connected with the people who elected him. Today's flight to Phoenix was particularly important. He was scheduled to speak at a Veterans Advocacy Conference, an event close to his heart given his own military background. As Vance reached the gate area, he noticed the unusual tension in the air. Passengers were clustered in small groups, speaking in hushed tones, occasionally glancing toward the airline counter where several uniformed staff members appeared to be engaged in heated discussion. The large departure board above showed his flight as delayed, with no updated time listed, which immediately caught his attention. The gate agent, a middle-aged woman named Sarah Mitchell, who had been working for the airline for over 15 years, seemed particularly stressed as she fielded question after question from increasingly frustrated passengers. Vance had learned long ago that patience was a virtue in both politics and travel. So he found a seat near the window and pulled out his phone to review his speech notes while waiting for an announcement. 20 minutes passed before Sarah finally picked up the microphone. Her voice carried a mixture of professionalism and barely concealed anxiety as she addressed the waiting passengers. The mechanical issue that had initially caused the delay had been resolved, she announced. But now, they were facing what she diplomatically termed passenger manifest complications. Several passengers would need to be reassigned to later flights due to overbooking issues that had come to light during the maintenance delay. Vance looked up from his phone, sensing that this announcement was just the beginning of what promised to be a challenging morning. Around him, business travelers checked their watches nervously. Families with young children began gathering their scattered belongings, and a group of college students started making alternative travel arrangements on their phones. The atmosphere in the gate area shifted from mild inconvenience to genuine concern as people realized their carefully planned schedules were about to be disrupted. Sarah began calling names from a printed list, asking certain passengers to approach the counter. The selection process seemed random to most observers, a mix of business travelers, families, and individuals from various walks of life. Each person called forward engaged in brief, intense conversations with the airline staff, some walking away, shaking their heads in frustration, others accepting rebooking offers with resigned acceptance. When Sarah called Senator Vance, the background chatter in the gate area noticeably diminished. Other passengers turned to watch as the tall, familiar figure rose from his seat and walked calmly toward the counter. Vance had been recognized by several travelers throughout the morning, though most had respectfully maintained their distance, understanding that even public figures deserved privacy during routine travel. The conversation at the counter began cordially enough. Sarah explained that due to the overbooking situation and the need to accommodate passengers who had been waiting since the previous evening due to weather delays, some travelers would need to take later flights. She had several options available, including a flight departing in 3 hours with a first-class upgrade or an evening departure that would still get him to Phoenix in time for his conference the following day. Vance listened patiently to the options, occasionally nodding as he processed the information. His demeanor remained calm and professional, the same composed presence he maintained during challenging Senate hearings or heated political debates. However, as Sarah continued explaining the airline's position, it became clear that this wasn't a simple request for voluntary rebooking. Passengers on the list were being involuntarily removed from the flight. The turning point came when Vance politely asked to see the criteria used for selecting passengers to be removed from the flight. Sarah hesitated, glancing toward her supervisor who had been monitoring the conversation from a few feet away. The supervisor, a stern-looking man in his 50s named Robert Chen, stepped forward and explained that the selection was based on various factors, including ticket purchase date, frequent flyer status, and other operational considerations. Vance's expression remained neutral, but those watching closely could see a subtle shift in his posture, the straightening of shoulders and slight forward lean that those familiar with his political career recognized as his preparation for a principled stand. He had built his reputation on asking tough questions and demanding transparency, whether in military service, corporate boardrooms, or the halls of Congress. The gate area had grown quieter as more passengers became aware of the unfolding situation. Some recognized the senator and were curious to see how he would handle what appeared to be preferential treatment in reverse, a public figure being singled out for inconvenience rather than special accommodation. Others were simply interested in observing how the airline would handle what was clearly becoming a delicate situation. Vance requested to speak with a senior manager, maintaining his courteous tone while making it clear that he wasn't satisfied with the explanations provided. The request sent a ripple of activity through the airline staff, with several employees making phone calls and engaging in hurried consultations. The other passengers who had been asked to give up their seats watched with interest, perhaps hoping that the senator's intervention might benefit everyone facing rebooking. As they waited for management to arrive, Vance engaged in friendly conversation with some of the other affected passengers, learning about their travel plans and the importance of their various destinations. This wasn't a political performance. It was the genuine interest in people's stories that had characterized his approach throughout his career, from his best-selling memoir to his work as a senator representing everyday Americans. 25 minutes after Vance's request for senior management, a woman in a crisp navy blue suit approached the gate area with purposeful strides. Patricia Williams had been the regional operations manager for the airline for 8 years and had handled countless challenging situations, but dealing with elected officials always required a delicate touch. She had spent the past several minutes reviewing the passenger manifest, company policies, and the specific circumstances that had led to this particular overbooking situation. Williams introduced herself to Vance with professional courtesy, acknowledging his position while maintaining that all passengers were subject to the same policies and procedures. However, as she began explaining the airline's position in greater detail, it became apparent that the situation was more complex than initially presented. The overbooking hadn't resulted from typical overselling practices, but rather from a last-minute decision to accommodate a group of passengers whose previous flight had been canceled due to crew scheduling issues at another airport. Vance listened carefully as Williams outlined the airline's contractual obligations to the stranded passengers, their legal authority to involuntarily deny boarding under specific circumstances, and the compensation packages being offered to affected travelers. Her presentation was thorough and professional, backed by years of experience in airline operations and customer service recovery. However, Vance's questions revealed inconsistencies in how the passenger selection process had been conducted. The senator asked Williams to explain why certain passengers with later booking dates or lower frequent flyer status had retained their seats, while others, including himself, had been selected for removal. Williams consulted her tablet, scrolling through screens of data before admitting that the selection algorithm had considered factors beyond the standard criteria. When pressed for specifics, she revealed that passenger profile assessments had been part of the decision-making process. This revelation caught the attention of several other passengers who had been quietly observing the exchange. A business consultant named Michael Torres, who had been selected for rebooking despite being a platinum frequent flyer, stepped closer to listen. Next to him, Dr. Jennifer Hassan, a pediatric surgeon traveling to Phoenix for an emergency consultation, realized that her removal from the flight might not have been as random as initially suggested. Vance's background as both a military veteran and a trained lawyer served him well as he methodically questioned Williams about the airline's passenger profiling practices. His questions weren't aggressive or confrontational, but they demonstrated a clear understanding of federal transportation regulations and passenger rights. Williams found herself explaining policies that she admitted were not typically disclosed to passengers during routine rebooking situations. The conversation took an unexpected turn when Williams mentioned that the airline's customer service system included notations about passengers who had previously filed complaints, requested special accommodations, or been involved in any incidents during travel. Vance asked whether public figures or individuals likely to generate media attention were flagged differently in the system, a question that visibly made Williams uncomfortable. As Williams hedged her response, other passengers began asking their own questions. Torres wanted to know why his military veteran status, which should have provided certain protections under federal law, hadn't prevented his selection for rebooking. Dr. Hassan inquired whether the airline had considered the medical emergency nature of her travel when making rebooking decisions. An elderly couple, the Johnsons, asked why they had been separated with only Mrs. Johnson selected for rebooking, despite traveling on the same reservation. The situation was evolving from a simple overbooking issue into a broader examination of airline practices and passenger rights. Williams realized that her standard customer service responses weren't addressing the legitimate concerns being raised, and she found herself promising to review individual cases while the growing group of passengers waited for satisfactory answers. Vance suggested that rather than handling each case individually, Williams should explain the airline's overall passenger selection methodology so that everyone could understand how rebooking decisions were made. This request put Williams in a difficult position. Fully explaining the airline's practices might reveal proprietary algorithms and decision trees that the company preferred to keep confidential, but continuing to provide vague answers was clearly not resolving the situation. During a brief pause in the conversation, Vance pulled out his phone and made a quick call to his chief of staff, asking her to research federal aviation regulations regarding involuntary denied boarding and passenger rights. He wasn't threatening legal action or using his political position to demand special treatment. He was gathering information that would help all the affected passengers understand their options and rights. The phone call seemed to shift the dynamic of the entire situation. Williams realized that this wasn't going to be resolved with standard corporate customer service techniques. The other passengers recognized that Vance was using his knowledge and resources not just for his own benefit, but to advocate for everyone facing rebooking. Even passengers who weren't affected by the rebooking began paying attention, sensing that something significant was unfolding. Airport security personnel, who had been monitoring the situation from a distance, moved closer to the gate area. Their presence wasn't threatening. They were simply following standard protocols when passengers gathered in groups and conversations became extended. However, their visibility added another layer of complexity to an already delicate situation. Williams excused herself to make several phone calls, presumably to her supervisors and the airline's legal department. During her absence, Vance engaged with the other affected passengers, learning more about their individual situations and the impact that rebooking would have on their plans. Dr. Hassan explained the time-sensitive nature of her medical consultation. Torres described the important client meeting he would miss, and the Johnsons shared their concerns about navigating a complex travel day while being separated. These conversations reinforced Vance's growing conviction that the airline's rebooking process wasn't just inconvenient, it was potentially discriminatory and certainly not in line with the transparent, fair treatment that passengers deserved. As Williams returned from her phone calls, Vance was prepared to take the discussion in a direction that would challenge not just this particular rebooking decision, but the broader practices that had led to it. When Patricia Williams returned from her phone calls, her expression had changed noticeably. The confident professionalism she had displayed earlier was now tempered with visible concern, suggesting that her conversations with corporate headquarters had not gone as smoothly as she had hoped. She approached the growing group of affected passengers with a slightly different demeanor, one that suggested the airline was beginning to recognize the potential magnitude of the situation they were facing. Williams began by acknowledging that There had been some irregularities in the passenger selection process, and that the airline was committed to reviewing their procedures to ensure full compliance with federal regulations. However, she maintained that the immediate rebooking decisions needed to stand due to operational constraints and existing commitments to other passengers. This response prompted Vance to ask a question that would prove to be pivotal in the unfolding drama. Vance inquired whether the airline's passenger profiling system included any political affiliations, public statements, or social media activity in its assessment criteria. The question was asked calmly and professionally, but it cut to the heart of a concern that had been growing in his mind as he listened to Williams's earlier explanations. The pause before her response was telling. Williams clearly hadn't expected this level of scrutiny of the airline's internal processes. Williams initially attempted to deflect the question, stating that passenger privacy was of utmost importance to the airline and that they didn't collect unnecessary personal information. However, Vance's follow-up questions revealed his familiarity with data collection practices and customer relationship management systems used throughout various industries. His experience in the business world before entering politics had given him insights into how companies gather and utilize customer information that many passengers wouldn't possess. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of two additional airline officials, the airport's customer service director and a representative from the airline's corporate communications team. Their presence signaled that the situation had escalated beyond routine operational issues and was now being treated as a potential public relations challenge. The communications representative, a young professional named David Park, immediately began taking notes and occasionally whispering into his phone. Dr. Hassan chose this moment to interject with information that added another layer of complexity to the situation. She revealed that she had received a text message from a colleague who was tracking flight information and had noticed that several passengers with connections through Phoenix to smaller destinations had been allowed to remain on the flight despite having booking dates later than those selected for rebooking. This information suggested that the selection process might have prioritized certain routes or destinations over others. Michael Torres supported Dr. Hassan's observation with his own research, showing screenshots from the airline's app indicating that passengers traveling to final destinations where the airline faced less competition had been more likely to retain their seats. This revelation painted a picture of rebooking decisions potentially influenced by business considerations, rather than the fair and transparent criteria that passengers had a right to expect. Vance asked Williams directly whether revenue management or competitive market analysis played any role in passenger selection for involuntary denied boarding. This question struck at fundamental issues of fairness and transparency in airline operations, and Williams's hesitation in responding was noted by everyone present. The corporate communications representative stepped forward, suggesting that detailed operational procedures weren't typically discussed in public settings. This suggestion prompted Vance to make what would later be remembered as a defining statement in the entire incident. He calmly but firmly stated that as a United States Senator, he had both the right and the responsibility to understand whether American citizens were being treated fairly by companies operating under federal transportation regulations. He wasn't seeking special treatment for himself, but he was demanding transparency and accountability that would benefit all passengers. The statement shifted the entire dynamic of the situation. Other passengers began voicing their own concerns more assertively, feeling empowered by Vance's advocacy. Airport security personnel moved closer, not to intervene, but to monitor a situation that was clearly attracting attention from other travelers throughout the gate area. Several passengers not involved in the rebooking began recording videos with their phones, sensing that they were witnessing something significant. Williams found herself caught between corporate policies designed to protect proprietary information and the legitimate demands for transparency being made by a sitting senator and the affected passengers. The customer service director attempted to regain control of the situation by offering enhanced compensation packages to all affected passengers, including hotel accommodations, meal vouchers, and significant flight credits for future travel. However, Vance made it clear that while he appreciated the gesture, the fundamental issues of transparency and fair treatment couldn't be resolved through compensation alone. He suggested that the airline had an opportunity to demonstrate real leadership by voluntarily reviewing their passenger selection processes and making their criteria publicly available rather than waiting for potential federal regulatory action. Dr. Hassan supported Vance's position by noting that transparency would actually benefit the airline by building passenger trust and demonstrating their commitment to fair treatment. Torres added that business travelers would have more confidence in the airline if they understood how operational decisions were made and could plan accordingly. The communications representative was now making frequent phone calls, clearly coordinating with headquarters on how to handle a situation that had evolved far beyond a routine customer service issue. The presence of recording passengers and the involvement of a prominent political figure had transformed a local operational problem into a potential national story about airline practices and passenger rights. As the discussion continued, it became apparent that this was no longer just about whether specific passengers would make their originally scheduled flight. The situation had become a test case for broader issues of corporate accountability, passenger rights, and the role of public officials in advocating for fair treatment of American citizens by companies operating in regulated industries. The atmosphere in the gate area had transformed dramatically over the past hour. What had begun as a routine travel inconvenience had evolved into an impromptu public forum on corporate accountability and passenger rights. Vance found himself in an unexpected role, not just as an affected passenger seeking resolution for his own travel plans, but as an advocate for systematic change in how airlines treat American travelers. The arrival of airport police officers marked another escalation in the situation, though their presence seemed precautionary rather than threatening. Officer Maria Rodriguez, a veteran of airport security with 15 years of experience, approached the group with professional calm. She had dealt with countless passenger disputes, but situations involving elected officials required special attention to ensure that all parties' rights were protected while maintaining airport security protocols. Officer Rodriguez spoke briefly with Patricia Williams and the other airline officials before approaching Vance directly. Her conversation with the senator was cordial and professional. She simply wanted to understand the nature of the dispute and ensure that all discussions remained peaceful and didn't disrupt airport operations. Vance assured her that he was committed to resolving the situation through dialogue and proper channels, not confrontation. The police presence, however, had an unintended consequence. Several passengers who had been recording the interaction with their phones began posting videos and updates on social media platforms. Within minutes, hashtags related to the incident began trending locally, and news outlets started picking up the story. David Park, the airline's communications representative, was now managing what had become a developing public relations crisis. Dr. Jennifer Hassan received a phone call during this period that added urgency to her personal situation. The pediatric patient she was traveling to consult on had taken a turn for the worse, making her expertise even more critically needed. She shared this information with the group, emphasizing that the airline's rebooking decisions weren't just inconvenient. They had real-world consequences that extended far beyond travel schedules. This revelation prompted Vance to ask Williams a pointed question about the airline's procedures for handling emergency travel situations. Did they have protocols for identifying and protecting passengers whose travel was related to medical emergencies, family crises, or other time-sensitive situations? Williams admitted that while such procedures existed on paper, they weren't consistently applied during routine rebooking operations. Michael Torres contributed his own perspective as a small business owner, explaining how missing his client meeting would affect not just his own livelihood, but the several employees who depended on the contract he was traveling to finalize. The Johnson elderly couple shared their concerns about being separated during travel, noting their medical conditions and the stress that travel disruptions placed on passengers their age. These personal stories transformed the abstract discussion. of airline policies into a human narrative that resonated with other passengers in the gate area. Several travelers who weren't affected by the rebooking began expressing support for the group's quest for transparency and fair treatment. Some shared their own experiences with airline rebooking practices, creating an atmosphere of shared concern about passenger rights. The customer service director made another attempt to resolve the situation by offering to personally review each affected passenger's case and provide individualized solutions. However, Vance politely but firmly redirected the conversation back to the broader issue of systematic problems with the airline's passenger selection processes. Individual accommodations, while appreciated, wouldn't address the underlying issues that had created the situation. At this point, Vance made a decision that would define the remainder of the incident. He announced that he was formally requesting a complete explanation of the airline's passenger profiling and selection algorithms under federal transparency regulations that governed companies operating in the aviation industry. He wasn't making threats or seeking special treatment. He was exercising legitimate oversight authority to ensure that American passengers were being treated fairly. The request sent David Park into another round of urgent phone calls with corporate headquarters, and likely the airline's legal department. Williams and the customer service director exchanged concerned glances, realizing that what had begun as a routine operational issue had now become a formal regulatory inquiry that would require careful legal and policy review. Dr. Hassan asked whether the airline would be willing to implement immediate reforms to their passenger selection process while the broader review was conducted. She suggested that emergency travel situations should be automatically protected from involuntary rebooking and that selection criteria should be clearly posted and consistently applied. Torres supported this suggestion, noting that transparency would actually improve customer relations and reduce disputes. The Johnson couple made a simple but powerful observation. They had been flying for over 40 years and had never seen Airline policies explained so clearly or questioned so thoroughly. Mrs. Johnson commented that it seemed like passengers had been expected to simply accept whatever decisions airlines made without understanding the reasoning behind those decisions. Officer Rodriguez had been quietly observing the entire interaction and approached Vance with a question that surprised everyone present. She asked whether passengers had any legal recourse when they believed airline rebooking decisions were unfair or discriminatory. Her question suggested that airport security personnel regularly witnessed situations where passengers felt mistreated but didn't know their rights or options for addressing their concerns. Vance's response demonstrated both his legal background and his commitment to public service. He explained that passengers did have rights under federal aviation regulations, but that these rights were often not clearly communicated and enforcement mechanisms were limited. He suggested that one outcome of the current situation should be better education for passengers about their rights and clearer procedures for addressing grievances. The conversation had now attracted a significant crowd of observers, including other passengers waiting for flights, airport employees, and even some airline crew members who were interested in the discussion of policies that affected their daily work. The gate area had become an unintended classroom on passenger rights and corporate accountability, with Vance serving as both participant and educator in a real-time case study of American consumer protection. The tension in the gate area reached a pivotal moment when Patricia Williams received what appeared to be a decisive phone call from airline headquarters. Her body language during the conversation suggested that significant decisions were being made at the corporate level, and when she ended the call, her approach to the situation had fundamentally changed. The airline had clearly decided that continuing to resist transparency would create more problems than providing the explanations that Vance and the other passengers were seeking. Williams announced that the airline's senior management had authorized her to provide a comprehensive explanation of their passenger selection processes and to implement immediate changes to address the concerns that had been raised. This announcement marked a turning point in the entire incident, transforming what had been a defensive corporate response into a collaborative effort to address legitimate passenger rights issues. The explanation that Williams provided was more detailed and honest than anyone had expected. She revealed that the airline's customer management system did indeed include behavioral profiles that tracked passengers who had filed complaints, requested special accommodations, or been involved in any incidents during travel. While this information wasn't intended to be discriminatory, she acknowledged that it could inadvertently influence rebooking decisions in ways that weren't fair or transparent. More significantly, Williams admitted that the airline's revenue management system did consider the competitive implications of rebooking decisions. Passengers traveling to destinations where the airline faced limited competition were more likely to be selected for involuntary rebooking because the airline assumed they would have fewer alternative travel options. This practice, while not illegal, raised serious questions about fairness and the prioritization of business considerations over passenger rights. Dr. Hassan asked the obvious follow-up question: if the airline knew these practices were problematic, why hadn't they been changed before now? Williams' response was remarkably candid. She explained that airlines operated in an extremely competitive environment with thin profit margins, and that passenger advocacy had historically been less organized and effective than advocacy for other industries. Companies had been able to maintain practices that benefited their operations without sufficient accountability to passengers. Vance seized on this admission to make a broader point about the role of elected officials in protecting constituent interests. He noted that his involvement in this situation wasn't about seeking special treatment for himself, but about using his position and knowledge to advocate for fair treatment of all American travelers. He suggested that the incident demonstrated why oversight and transparency were essential in regulated industries. The crowd of observing passengers had grown significantly, and several began sharing their own experiences with airline rebooking practices. A military veteran described being bumped from flights despite regulations that should have protected his travel. A business consultant shared stories of clients who had lost significant contracts due to unexplained travel disruptions. A family with young children recounted the challenges of managing rebooking situations when traveling with medical equipment and special needs accommodations. These testimonials created a powerful narrative that extended far beyond the specific incident at hand. The gate area had become an impromptu forum for passengers to share experiences that many had previously accepted as unavoidable aspects of modern air travel. The presence of recording devices meant that these stories were being documented and shared beyond the immediate audience. Michael Torres made an observation that resonated strongly with the listening crowd. He noted that in most service industries, customers understood the criteria used for prioritization and decision-making. Hotels explained their upgrade policies, restaurants had clear reservation systems, and even ride-sharing services provided transparent pricing algorithms. Airlines, however, had maintained opacity around critical decisions that significantly affected passengers' lives and livelihoods. Officer Maria Rodriguez contributed an unexpected perspective to the discussion. She mentioned that airport security personnel regularly witnessed passenger frustration with airline policies, but that passengers rarely had access to the information they needed to understand or challenge those policies. She suggested that clearer communication of passenger rights and airline procedures would reduce conflicts and improve the overall airport experience for everyone involved. The airline's customer service director made a significant announcement. At this point, he stated that the airline would immediately implement several policy changes based on the discussion that had taken place. Emergency medical travel would be automatically protected from involuntary rebooking, passenger selection. Criteria would be made publicly available, and the company would establish a passenger advocacy board to review rebooking policies on an ongoing basis. Furthermore, all passengers affected by the current incident would be accommodated on the original flight through a combination of aircraft changes and crew scheduling adjustments that the airline had initially claimed were impossible. This resolution demonstrated that many operational constraints were actually policy choices rather than immutable limitations. Dr. Hassan was able to make her original flight and provide the urgent pediatric consultation that had motivated her. Travel. Torres would make his critical business meeting, potentially saving jobs and contracts that depended on the successful negotiation. The Johnson couple would travel together as originally planned, avoiding the stress and potential health risks of separation during travel. However, the most significant outcome wasn't the resolution of individual travel plans, but the broader changes that the airline committed to implementing. Vance had successfully transformed a personal inconvenience into a catalyst for systemic improvement that would benefit countless future passengers. The incident demonstrated how individual advocacy, when conducted with knowledge and persistence, could create meaningful change in corporate practices. The crowd of observing passengers began to disperse as boarding preparations resumed, but many stopped to thank Vance for his advocacy and to share contact information with the other affected passengers. The incident had created a temporary community united around principles of fairness and transparency, and many expressed hope that similar advocacy would continue in other contexts where consumers faced unfair treatment. As passengers began boarding the flight that had been at the center of the morning's dramatic events, the atmosphere throughout the gate area had transformed completely. What had begun with tension and frustration had evolved into something resembling a victory celebration, with passengers and airport staff alike recognizing that they had witnessed something significant. The successful resolution had demonstrated that individual advocacy, supported by knowledge and persistence, could create meaningful change even in industries where consumers typically felt powerless. Vance took a few moments to speak individually with each of the passengers who had been affected by the original rebooking decision. His conversations with Dr. Hassan, Michael Torres, and the Johnson couple weren't political gestures or photo opportunities. They were genuine expressions of concern for fellow travelers who had faced unfair treatment. These brief interactions revealed the personal qualities that had helped him connect with constituents throughout his political career. Dr. Hassan expressed her gratitude not just for the resolution of her travel situation, but for the broader changes that would protect other passengers facing medical emergencies. She noted that as a physician, she understood how critical timing could be in healthcare situations, and the airline's commitment to protecting emergency medical travel would likely save lives in future situations. Her professional perspective added weight to the significance of the policy changes that had been achieved. Torres approached Vance with a business perspective on the morning's events. He observed that the airline's initial resistance to transparency had actually created more problems than honesty would have caused. The company's eventual willingness to explain their processes and commit to reforms had transformed a potential public relations disaster into an opportunity to demonstrate responsiveness to customer concerns. He suggested that other industries might learn from both the airline's mistakes and their ultimate resolution. The elderly Johnson couple provided perhaps the most touching response to the situation. Mrs. Johnson told Vance that in their 40 years of flying, they had never seen anyone stand up for passengers the way he had done. She noted that most passengers simply accepted whatever airlines decided, assuming that they had no recourse when treated unfairly. The morning's events had shown them that advocacy was possible and that their rights as consumers mattered. Officer Maria Rodriguez made a point of speaking with Vance before his departure. She mentioned that airport security personnel often felt helpless when witnessing passenger frustration with airline policies, knowing that travelers had legitimate concerns but lacking the authority or knowledge to provide meaningful assistance. The morning's demonstration of effective advocacy had given her insights that she planned to share with other security staff and potentially incorporate into passenger assistance training. Patricia Williams approached Vance as boarding neared completion, offering a professional acknowledgement of his role in driving positive change. She admitted that the airline's initial handling of the situation had been defensive and ultimately counterproductive. The transparency and reforms that resulted from his advocacy would benefit both passengers and airline employees, who would now have clearer guidelines and more defensible policies to implement. David Park, the airline's communications representative, had a different perspective on the morning's events. While the incident had initially seemed like a public relations challenge, the airline's eventual transparency and commitment to reform had actually generated positive coverage that demonstrated the company's responsiveness to customer concerns. He noted that many companies in similar situations chose to maintain defensive positions rather than engaging in productive dialogue with critics. As Vance settled into his seat for the flight to Phoenix, he reflected on the broader implications of the morning's events. The incident had illustrated several important principles that extended far beyond airline travel. Individual citizens had rights and recourse when treated unfairly by corporations, but exercising those rights required knowledge, persistence, and sometimes advocacy from those with relevant expertise and authority. The role of elected officials in protecting constituent interests had been demonstrated in real time. Rather than using his position to secure special treatment for himself, Vance had leveraged his knowledge and authority to advocate for fair treatment of all passengers. This approach to public service, using official positions to address systematic problems rather than seeking personal benefits, exemplified the kind of leadership that voters had a right to expect from their representatives. The power of transparency in corporate accountability had been clearly illustrated. The airline's initial resistance to explaining their decision-making processes had created suspicion and conflict, while their eventual openness had enabled productive dialogue and meaningful reform. Other industries facing similar challenges might learn from this example of how transparency could transform adversarial relationships into collaborative problem-solving. The incident also demonstrated the importance of individual advocacy in driving systemic change. Without the affected passengers' willingness to ask questions, demand explanations, and persist in seeking fair treatment, the underlying problems with airline rebooking practices would have remained unchanged. Their advocacy, supported by Vance's expertise and authority, had created benefits that would extend to countless future travelers. As the aircraft prepared for takeoff, Vance received several text messages from colleagues and staff members who had been monitoring news coverage of the incident. The story had gained national attention, with coverage focusing on both the specific airline policy changes and the broader principles of consumer advocacy and corporate accountability that had been demonstrated. The incident was being discussed as an example of effective constituent service and individual advocacy working together to address systematic problems. The flight to Phoenix proceeded smoothly, but the morning's events at Cincinnati Northern Kentucky International Airport had created ripple effects that would extend far beyond a single travel day. The airline's policy changes would benefit countless future passengers. The demonstration of effective advocacy would inspire others facing similar challenges, and the principle of transparency in corporate decision-making had been reinforced through practical example rather than theoretical argument. What had begun as a routine travel inconvenience had become a catalyst for meaningful change in how airlines treat American passengers.